And so the Kalam cosmological argument is an argument from the beginning of the universe to the existence of God. So it takes the fact that the universe began to exist, and then it says, what can we know about this fact? What can we know about the fact that the universe began to exist? But not only that, but if the universe began to exist, then it has a cause. And so what can we know about the cause of the universe? This is what the Kalam cosmological argument seeks to do. It's in this way that the argument operates as an argument for God. Because what we do is we look at what sort of properties or attributes the cause of the universe would have. Okay? Hey, good morning. Good morning, guys. Morning, guys. And so I was just quickly reviewing here how 2 weeks ago we started a discussion on the Kalam cosmological argument, which, if you remember, was the argument from the beginning of the universe. If the universe has a beginning, then it has a cause of its existence. Premise 2, the universe began to exist, and therefore premise 3, the universe has a cause. And so this is an argument for God's existence in the sense that what we do is we evaluate the nature of the cause. What kind of cause could cause the universe to begin to exist? And that's what we'll do later on in class. But today, we're going to start a discussion about the second premise. Last time I argued that the first premise, which was if the universe began to exist, then the universe has a cause of its beginning. Last time I argued for that premise. And so today we're going to look at the second premise, which is that the universe began to exist. And so we have two different lines of argument for in defense of this premise. We have philosophical argument, and which is what we're going to start today. But then we also have scientific confirmation, and that's again something that we'll look at in the coming weeks. But so let's look at the first of the philosophical arguments for the beginning of the universe. Al-Ghazali, which, if you recall last week, was the 12th century Muslim theologian. I'm going to go ahead and shut this. So Al-Ghazali was the 12th century Muslim theologian that basically put this argument into a formal... He actually wrote a book on it. And so he sort of put all of this stuff together. So he's the sort of springboard which we're using to examine this argument. So he argued in the 12th century that if the universe never began to exist, then there has been an infinite number of past events prior to today. And that seems obvious. But then he argued an infinite number of things cannot exist. An infinite number of things cannot exist. And therefore it follows that there cannot have been an infinite past. So Al-Ghazali recognized that a potentially infinite number of things could exist. But what he expressly denied, was that an actually infinite number of things could exist. And so it's important that before we go further, we need to understand this distinction between a potential infinite and an actual infinite. And I've got it written up on the board here, this distinction here. And so what we'll do is we'll spend this first part of class looking at this distinction. And so when we say that something is potentially infinite, we mean that something is finite, but it's progressing toward infinity as a limit. It's never actually reached. And so you never actually arrive at infinity when you have a potential infinite. Infinity is simply a limit concept that you move toward constantly. And so, for example, take any finite distance. Take the distance between my two fingers here, if you're looking up here. You could divide this distance in half, and then into fourths, and then into eighths, and then into sixteenths, and then into 32nds, ad infinitum. You could do this forever. You could continually cut the distance in half. But you would never reach an infinitive division. So the number of divisions... Come on in, guys. Come on in, guys. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning.
You did a super job.
Yes. I talked to him. It was...
Super job, man. Infinitive.
Good morning. Good morning, guys. Is this your first time in Coffee and Theology? Okay, so let me give you some handouts here. See, if you guys want, you can share this, or I can get you copies each. You want to just share that one? Okay, so today what we're talking about is the Kalam cosmological argument, which is an argument for God's existence. And so what you might not know is that there are a plethora. There's a lot of arguments for God's existence apart from the Bible. And so one of the arguments we're looking at today is called the Kalam cosmological argument. And it argues from the beginning of the universe, the fact that the universe had a beginning implies that the universe had a cause. And so what sort of cause could the universe be? Or what kind of cause could cause the universe to come into being? That's what the basic argument is. So today what we're doing is we're looking at the second premise of the argument, which on your handout, the second premise is the universe began to exist. That's the second premise of the argument. And so what we're doing today is looking at a philosophical defense of this premise. And so what we did was we saw that Al-Ghazali, which was a 12th century Muslim theologian, he was the one who sort of formulated this argument. He said that it's impossible that an actually infinite number of things exist in reality. Okay, but he said that the past number of events is infinite if the universe is eternal. Right? If the universe did not begin to exist, then the number of past events is infinite. Okay, but you can't have an actual infinite number of things in reality, which we're going to look at defense of that in a second. But first, what we need to do is make a distinction between a potential infinite and an actual infinite. And so what we've done is we've looked at what a potential infinite is. And so a potential infinite is basically where you have a finite number of things that is continuously growing toward infinity as a limit. Okay, so for instance, I pointed to my fingers here. We could constantly cut this distance between my two fingers in half, then in fourths, then in eighths, then in sixteenths, then in 32nds. We could always cut that number in half again, and we can always do that toward infinity as a limit. We could do that ad infinitum. We could continually cut the division, or cut that distance in half. But you never actually arrive at infinity when you do this. You never arrive at an infinitive division. You never do it. You just continually go on endlessly. And so you would never have an actual infinite number of divisions or parts. You would never have that. You'd always have a finite number. And so the symbol for this kind of infinity is the lazy 8 that we're pretty familiar with. When we see the lazy 8, that we always think that means infinity. What this actually symbolizes is a potential infinite. Okay, which is actually a finite number of things that is constantly growing toward infinity as a limit. Okay, by contrast, an actual infinite is an infinite which, as it were, is complete. Okay, so an actual infinite is an infinite which is complete. The number of the items in the collection is not growing toward infinity, it just is infinite. Okay, it's a complete and it's a static number and involves an actually infinite number of things. How's it going? Good morning. Is this your first time to Coffee and Theology? Okay. Well, this is the handout for what we're discussing today. We're looking at an argument for God's existence.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Is this a new handout or is
You should have this one.
I have it.
You should have the Kalam cosmological argument. And so the difference between a potential infinite and an actual infinite, again, an actual infinite is where you have a complete and static collection of an infinite number of things. It's not growing toward infinity. You have an actual infinite set of infinite things. And so the infinity in this sense is symbolized by the Hebrew letter Aleph, which, as I've tried to write up here on the board, this is sort of what it looks like. Okay, Aleph. And it's used in set theory in mathematics. And so in set theory, mathematicians talk about sets, like the set of natural numbers. She should, yeah. Here's our mathematician. So she'll know. So we're talking about a distinction here between a potential infinite and an actual infinite. And so as a mathematician, you should know that when you talk about in set theory, the Hebrew letter Aleph is used in set theory to describe an actual infinite number of things, like the set of natural numbers, okay, from 0 to infinity. And so Aleph is the set of natural numbers. And so this collection of natural numbers is not growing toward infinity. The whole collection is just infinite. Okay? There are an actually infinite number of natural numbers in this set. Okay? And so what Al-Ghazali is claiming here is that while potentially infinite collections can exist, so that is to say collections that are always finite at any point in time but are always growing toward infinity, that's the potential infinite, there cannot be a collection that is actually infinite. There cannot be a collection that is actually infinite. A collection that has an actually infinite number of numbers in it. And so before we move on, let's just make sure that we understand this distinction here before we move on to the argument. Does everyone understand the distinction here between the potential and the actual infinite? Does everyone feel comfortable with that? Conroy, you look like you want to say something.
No, the potential part, I was taught was like, if you're in a classroom like this and you take a step towards a wall, but you decrease that step by half each time,
Right.
cut it in half, you'll never...
How's it going?
This is Ivan.
Ivan? These are the handouts for what we're discussing today. So we're talking about a argument for God's existence apart from Scripture, and it's called the Kalam cosmological argument. Today what we're discussing is a distinction here between a potential and an actual infinite. What was the illustration that you were just giving?
Illustration was if you walk towards the wall,
Right.
where you're at right now, but you take half of each step, you'll never reach the wall.
Right.
You'll never reach it.
Right, you'll never reach
As long as
it.
you cut it in half, I will never reach the wall at just standing by. So it's more of moving towards something.
Right.
Whereas
So infinity is the limit.
Right.
It's an ideal limit. You have never actually reached the limit.
You will never reach
As a
it.
potential, yeah. And so we can also think of that in terms of like the actual world. And so time. As time continually progresses, we're never going to reach an infinity number of time or anything like that. We're going to actually continually progress potentially toward infinity as a limit. Okay? But so that's what a potential infinite is. And so an actual infinite, on the other hand, is where you have an actual collection of infinite things. And so the example was in set theory, you have the set of natural numbers from 0 to infinity. Okay, and so that is an actual infinite collection of numbers. All right, and so it's not that these numbers are growing toward infinity, it's that you have a collection of infinite numbers. And it's not moving, it's not growing, it's just that's the collection, is infinite. Okay, and so Al-Ghazali's argument is essentially that you can have a potential infinite in the actual world, but you can't have an actual infinite number of things because it leads to various absurdities. And we're going to look at those absurdities in a second. But before we move on, just one last time, does everyone understand this distinction here between the potential infinite and the actual infinite? Feeling pretty strong?
Can you go over potential?
Okay, so a potential infinite is when you have it's a finite number of things. So finite is the opposite of infinite. Finite is you actually can apply a number to it. So, for instance, say that we have the number is 10. So we have 11, 12, 13, all the way up to infinity. And it's always growing toward infinity as a limit. But it's not an actually infinite number of things. You have a finite number, but it's always growing toward infinity. Okay? Does that sort of make sense? And again, the illustration was you can always, the distance between my two fingers, you could always cut it in half, cut it in fourths, cut it in eighths, sixteenths, 30-seconds, but you never reach an infinitive division. Okay? You never reach that division. You just continually cut it in half, continually cut it in half. You never actually reach it. Okay, so that's what a potential infinite is. But the actual infinite, on the other hand, is that you actually have an infinite set, like the set of natural numbers from 0 to infinity. That set is complete. It's not that the set is growing toward infinity. You have an infinite number of numbers in the set of natural numbers. Okay? So as long as we're feeling good on that distinction. And so again, Al-Ghazali never had a problem with potential infinites. These are just ideal limits. But he argued that an actual infinite number of things, if an actual infinite number of things could exist, then various absurdities would result. And so if we are to avoid these absurdities, we have to actually deny that an infinite number of things could exist. And so that would imply that the number of past events in the history of the universe, cannot be infinite, if an infinite number of things cannot exist. And so therefore the universe must have had a beginning. It's also, it's very frequently alleged that Al-Ghazali's sort of argument is invalidated by modern mathematics. Okay, and so in modern set theory, as I've said, the use of actual infinite is commonplace. They talk about Aleph The number of members in a set of the natural numbers is actually infinite in set theory. It's not just potentially infinite. But so many people have inferred that given the coherence of infinite set theory in mathematics, that this sort of argument is just a non-starter. Okay, because we can coherently talk about set theory, therefore it doesn't really make sense that an actual infinite number of things couldn't exist. But is this really the case? And so that's what we're going to look at today. So in modern set theory, it shows you that if you adopt certain axioms and rules, then you can talk about an actually infinite collection in a consistent way. If you adopt these axioms, if you adopt these rules, when you apply things like subtraction and division to infinite numbers, when you follow these rules, you can basically talk about it in a consistent way. But so all of this does is that it succeeds in setting up a certain universe of discourse that we can talk about these infinites in a consistent way. But it does nothing to show that these infinites can actually exist in reality. Okay? And so if Ghazali is right, this universe of discourse may be regarded simply as a fictional realm, sort of like Harry Potter. Okay, so we can talk about mathematical infinites, but that doesn't mean at all that it can actually exist in reality. And so I just want to open it up if you have any other questions at this point. Otherwise, we're going to move on to the absurdities that arise when you're considering an actual infinite number of things.
So for the theory, you're saying, for example, you have an algorithm or a theory, we can prove in the algebraic equation, okay, you put numbers in and you come to an answer, right, for the actual infinity. Because we're trying to prove a certain theory.
We're not trying to prove a certain theory. What I've done here is I've made a distinction between a potential infinite and an actual infinite. And so the example that I gave as an actual infinite comes from set theory, which is the set of natural numbers. Mm-hmm. So the set of natural numbers is infinite from 0 to infinity. That set, the collection, is infinite. And so you have an actual infinite collection in that set. Okay, and so the objection that I've just briefly discussed is that basically in mathematics, we can talk about infinites consistently. We can talk about it perfectly consistently. We don't have to worry about all these absurdities that arise. Right. But the point is that these absurdities don't arise because we have these axioms in mathematics that disallow us from doing things, from doing what's called inverse operations, like subtraction, like division. You can't do those with infinite numbers. You can't do that. It's disallowed. And so you can slap the hand of the mathematician, but if you have these infinite numbers, these infinite collections in reality, then you still have these absurdities, and you can't really have that. And so what this shows is that these infinite quantities can exist fictionally, sort of in your mind, like the world of Harry Potter. But that does nothing to show that they can actually exist in reality. So what we'll do now is we'll turn to the absurdities that arise when you're considering an actual infinite number of things. And so the way that we can bring this out, the impossibility of an actually infinite number of things, is by imagining what it would be like if such a collection could exist in reality, and then drawing out the absurd consequences of it. And so let me share with you a very popular illustration called Hilbert's Hotel. Hilbert's Hotel, which is the brainchild of the great German mathematician David Hilbert. David Hilbert was one of the most brilliant mathematicians to ever live. You might know who he is. Have you heard of Hilbert? So Hilbert warms us up by inviting us to imagine an ordinary hotel. Just think of any hotel that you've ever been to. And it has a finite number of rooms. Okay, and let's suppose that all of the rooms are occupied in this ordinary hotel. All of the rooms are occupied. There's not a single vacant room in this hotel. And so suppose that a new guest shows up at the front desk and is asking for a room. Okay? Sorry, the manager says, all the rooms are occupied, right? And so he has to turn him away. That's what normally happens. That's how hotels normally operate. But now Hilbert imagines, let's suppose we've got a hotel with an infinite number of rooms. And let's suppose once again that the hotel is completely occupied. In this infinite number of rooms in this hotel, every single room is occupied. And so we have to really appreciate this fact. Every room in this hotel is occupied. There's not a single vacancy in the entire infinite hotel. Every room has a flesh and blood person in it. But now suppose that a new guest shows up at the front desk asking for a room. No problem, says the manager. So what he does is he moves the guest that was in room 1, he moves them into room 2. He takes the guest that was in room number 2, puts him in room number 3. He takes the guest that was in room number 3, puts him in room number 4, and so on out to infinity. Okay? And so as a result of these transpositions, room number 1 now becomes vacant magically, and the new guest is easily accommodated. Okay? And yet before he arrived, literally all the rooms were full. Okay, so that's absurdity number 1. But it gets even worse. As Hilbert says, let's imagine that an infinite number of guests show up and are asking for a room, okay, in this hotel that is already completely occupied. All right, so they show up and they say, well, we need rooms. And he says, no problem, says the manager. He moves to the person.
No problem, man.
So what he does here, no problem. Apparently this is a hotel in Jamaica.
Yeah.
So what he does in Sandals Resort. Of course, they would have an infinite hotel there. So what he does in this case, we have an infinite number of people that have showed up asking for a room. And so what he does in this case is he takes the person who is in room 1, puts him in room number 2. The person who is in room number 2, he puts him in room number 4. The person that was in room number 3, room number 6. And so he basically puts the person in the room double his number. And so since any number multiplied by 2 is an even number, that means all the guests wind up in even-numbered rooms. So as a result, all the odd number rooms become vacant, and the infinity of new guests gratefully checks in. And yet before they arrived, literally all the rooms were full. Okay, all the rooms were filled. Can such a hotel exist in reality, is the question. And so since nothing hangs on the illustrations involving a hotel, this argument can be generalized to past events, to the existence of an actually infinite number of things, in regards to the actual infinite number of past events, if the universe was eternal. But what this does is it shows that this is completely absurd. Okay? But so let's now talk about what would happen if people started checking out of the hotel, if we want to draw the absurdities even further. So suppose that the people in the odd number rooms check out 1, 3, 5, 7, and so forth, all the way to infinity. How many guests are left? Well, we have all the even-numbered guests, which is an infinite number of guests. Okay, so even though an infinite number of guests checked out, we still have an infinite number of guests left. Okay, but now let's suppose that instead of all the guests in the rooms, let's now suppose that all the guests in rooms 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 out to infinity check out. So not just the odd numbers, but everyone above room number 3. So 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 out to infinity. So how many guests are left over at this point? So if there is a room number 0, we have 3 left over. So infinity minus infinity is 3. But we just saw that infinity minus infinity is infinity.
Yeah.
And so literally, that's why in mathematics you have these rules in place, because you get these contradictions when you subtract infinities. When you subtract infinity, you can literally get any number from 0 to infinity. Okay? You subtract identical quantities from identical quantities, and you get non-identical results, which is absurd. And so the question we want to ask is this hotel really possible? That's the question before us, right? Can there be such a hotel? I heard another illustration where suppose you had an infinite number of marbles, okay, and you wanted to lend some marbles to your friend. You could lend him an infinite number of marbles and have an infinite number left with you, right? So imagine that you numbered all of your marbles and you give him all the even-numbered marbles, okay? So he has an infinite number of marbles and you have an infinite number of odd marbles, okay? But now suppose that you want to give him all the marbles that are greater than 3. Okay, you want to give him all the marbles that are greater than 3. All right? And so he has an infinite number of marbles, and you only have 3 left. And so you gave him actually the same number of marbles in both cases, but you have a different number of marbles left over. And so you can see it's the same principle, is that you subtract identical quantities from identical quantities, and you get contradictory results. Do we have any questions about the absurdities that arise when you're discussing these actual infinites? And so again, the argument is sort of that you can't have these actual infinites in reality because it leads to these various absurdities. And we don't see absurdities existing in reality, right? We don't see these explicit contradictions in reality, right? And so, and the hotel illustration is probably one of the best illustrations that I've found. You have this infinite hotel that is completely occupied, and then people can just check in. An infinite number of people can check in. You can have an infinite number of buses filled each with an infinite number of people, and each of them come in, and they could all be accommodated in the hotel. You can completely multiply the illustration to show all the absurdities that would result when you look deeply into it. And so, really, I think the only thing that the critic can do at this point is just to bite the bullet and say that Hilbert's Hotel is not absurd. That, yeah, that's right, that's exactly how it would be. And sometimes they'll justify this by saying that if an actual infinite number of things could exist, then these situations, these absurd situations, are exactly what we should expect. But again, I don't think this is an adequate response, because Hilbert, the guy, again, who gave this illustration, would of course agree that if an infinite hotel could exist, then the situation that he imagined is exactly what we would expect. It wouldn't be a good illustration if that weren't true. So, of course, this is what would happen if an actual infinite number of things could exist. But the question before us, again, is a hotel really possible? Can a hotel like that actually exist in reality? And I think that these illustrations show that no, such a thing is not really possible. It's metaphysically absurd. And so I think that Al-Ghazali's first argument is a good argument. And it shows that the number of past events must be finite. Therefore, the universe must have had a beginning. And so we can summarize the argument as follows. And I think it might be on the outline. I think it is, yeah. So an actual infinite cannot exist. An actual infinite number of things cannot exist. A beginningless series of past events involves an actually infinite number of things. And so again, if we have an eternal universe in the past, then there's an infinite number of events in the past. And so an eternal universe, a beginningless series of past events, involves an actually infinite number of things. Number 3, therefore, an infinite temporal regress of events cannot exist. Or, as I've put on the outline here, therefore, a beginningless series of past events cannot exist. And so that's the basic, this is the first philosophical argument in defense of premise 2, which is, again, that the universe began to exist. And so next time we're going to look at a second independent philosophical argument that Al-Ghazali offers for the beginning of the universe and the finitude of the past. But let's go ahead and open it up for discussion about this argument that we've discussed today. Does this seem like a good argument to you? Are you convinced? Are you skeptical? Do you have any questions?
So the big picture is the universe is not infinite.
The past.
The past.
The past, yeah. The past series of events has to be finite.
Right.
Okay,
Good.
so does that mean in the illustration of Hilbert's Hotel, the past would be like a full infinite hotel?
Right.
And the present or the future would be more people coming in and checking into the hotel and they automatically making rooms for it?
Well, no, so what we're supposing is that the past events is identical to the number of rooms in the hotel. Okay, and so we're basically just taking those past events and we're shuffling them around and we're doing things with those past events. We're not doing anything with the future or the present. We're just looking at the number of past events and sort of shuffling them around, subtracting identical quantities from identical quantities. So, for instance, we could be subtracting all the even-numbered events from the odd-numbered events, and we would have an infinity number of events left over. But if we took all the past events greater than, say, or less than -3, then we'd have a finite number of past events. And so we can sort of see this, the absurdities that arise in that sense. And so it's just an illustration of the sort of past events in the universe. I don't want it to be confused with like the future or the present or anything like that. We're just taking this collection, which again is an actual infinite number of things. It's got to be if the past is eternal. That we have an infinite number of past events. So it's like the set of natural numbers. It's a collection of infinite things, past events. And so we just take those and we can sort of use them to be illustrated as a number of hotel rooms. And then guest checking out would be just taking away dates in our mind. We would just take the even number dates out or events out. And so, does that make sense? I feel like I'm rambling at this point.
Well, because things are infinite, then you can never get to a conclusion or to the end because it's infinite. So no matter what you do, there's not a what should I
You
say?
can never reach.
Never reach.
Right. So that's actually the second philosophical argument, which is what we're going to look at next time. And it's a little bit more nuanced. There's a lot that goes into that argument as well. But this one is that you can't have an actually infinite set of things that exist in reality. Like you couldn't have an infinite number of marbles. You couldn't have an infinite number of bicycles. That kind of thing is that you can't have an actually infinite number of things because you would start to get all of these absurdities that would arise. Okay, so like the illustration I gave, if you have an infinite set of marbles and you start giving them away, right, you could still have an infinite number of marbles even though you've given out an infinite number. But then again, if you gave all the marbles that were greater than 3, you'd only have 3 left over. So all these absurdities that arise.
There's a if you give away marbles that are odd numbers, if you give away marbles that are even, if you give a marbles that are less than or greater than 3.
Right.
So once you have that clause, that makes the argument infinite.
Mm-hmm.
That's what
I'm not sure. Can you rephrase the question?
The question is that because there's a clause, because there's a condition regarding, okay, the infinite.
If you were to give this away,
yeah, right.
then you'd have these
Right.
absurdities.
Exactly. So there's a condition there. So the thing is that no matter what, because that condition is there, it will always be infinite.
I guess I'm not understanding what you're...
What I'm trying to... You said that things... you were giving the illustration of, let's use the marbles.
Right.
And you have the odd ones,
Mm-hmm.
right? So what I'm saying that we put condition on the illustration that you were saying. So in essence, the argument is, yes, it's going to be infinite.
What is going to be infinite?
Based on what I'm trying, I think I'm trying to get a connection with the infinite theory that things are going to be infinite because we have put condition on no matter what the illustration is. I'm looking at potential infinity.
Okay.
Okay. And
Okay, so again, the potential infinite is different. Okay, so a potential infinite is when you have an actual finite number of things that's always growing toward infinity.
okay.
An actual
But
infinite
it's
is when you
actual
have
infinity.
an actual
Yeah.
infinite number of
Okay,
things.
it's actual.
So yeah, so there's a
It's
yeah.
actual, it's
So there's a
actual.
big difference there. Yeah.
I'm sorry, it's the actual
Yeah.
infinity I'm talking about. So
Sorry, just a quick question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Potential one is meaning I use like when you deal with a fraction, like 1 over infinity times 1.
Not necessarily. You could have just again, if you were to start at 10 and you were to continually count toward infinity, you would always have a finite number, but it would always be growing toward infinity as a limit. You don't have to have a fraction. It could just be any number. You could have any number in the natural set of numbers, or even a real number. It could be any number. It doesn't matter. But it's basically that the potential infinite is when you have, again, a finite number of things. And so, for instance, just imagine that you have a 1 marble. You add another marble. You get another. You get another. That collection that you have there is always growing toward infinity, but it's never actually infinite. Okay. To have an actually infinite number of things, you have to start with an actually infinite number of things, which is sort of the next argument, is that you could never reach the present if you had an actual infinite number of past events. That's sort of like trying to jump out of an infinitely deep well. Like, how could you jump out at the level? And so that's sort of the argument that we'll look at next time. But these arguments are completely separate. Okay, so this one is about the absurdities. Again, think about Hilbert's Hotel. All of these absurdities arise if we have an actually infinite number of things, and which we're saying is what would be the case if the past number of events is infinite. We'd have an infinite number of past events. So we have about 5 minutes left. Let me go ahead and use this time to talk about our next Coffee and Theology meetup, which is going to be November 5th from 6 to 8 p.m., what Brittany's writing here on the board here. If you want to write this down, you can. It's on the city already. But so we're meeting at Louvre Bakery, Levure, however you want to pronounce it. I in the announcements I said Louvre. Who cares? Who cares? French. So bakery and coffee shop. It's in Tomball, right up the street off of Kirkendall. We're going to meet there November 5th, which is in 2 weeks.
What's that?
2 weeks away?
Saturday?
It's a Saturday, 6 to 8 p.m. And so this is our second Coffee and Theology meetup. And so basically this is a chance for just open discussion. If you want to come, you have just random questions about Christianity. If you want to bring friends that you have that might be interested in this, this is a perfect opportunity to bring them. We're not going to have any sort of outline that we're going to be discussing. It's just going to be, let's meet up, let's hang out. If you have questions, we can all discuss and that sort of thing. It's just very open-ended, very casual. So again, it's November 5th from 6 to 8 p.m. at Levure Bakery and Coffee Shop. This one we haven't been to yet. We're going to go check it out, but from the pictures and stuff, it looks pretty cool. So should be a pretty good time. So are there any other questions about the argument that we looked at today?
I still want to know, what if people don't believe that there is a beginning to the universe, what do they believe?
If they believe the universe is eternal?
Yeah.
So, well, this is why scientists nowadays are always trying to look for ways to avoid a beginning.
Right.
Cosmologists are constantly looking for ways to avoid a beginning. And so what this would allow...
If there is a beginning, that you have to say that
there's issues. And that's what we're going to look at with this argument.
Something that started it.
We have to look at, does the universe have a cause? What sort of cause could initiate the beginning of the universe? All of these sorts of questions start to pop up. And so, atheists want to avoid this, I think. And so what they'll do is they'll say that, well, the universe is eternal. The universe has just always been around for forever. And this is actually what Mormons believe. Mormons do not believe that the universe began to exist. They believe the universe has been around forever. And so this would actually be an argument against Mormonism in that sense, because it's for the beginning of the universe. But so there's a sort of, I think, desire for atheists, for naturalists, for materialists to avoid a beginning of the universe, because if the universe is eternal, they think the question of whether or not there needs to be an explanation for the universe seems to evaporate if we have an internal universe. But as we saw in the previous argument, we talked about the Leibnizian cosmological argument, which was the question, why does anything at all exist? Why is there a universe at all? Why, if the universe is eternal, why is the universe eternal? Why is it not finite? Why does this sort of universe exist as opposed to some other kind of universe? That question is a bit more fundamental than whether or not the universe has a beginning. Okay, so that's the question of why does anything at all exist? But as we saw in that first argument, there is no, it doesn't make an appeal to a beginning. And so the question would still arise, even if the universe was eternal. The question would still be, why does anything at all exist? The universe is not a necessary being. The universe is a contingent being, and so it's got to have some sort of explanation. And again, the illustration I gave that in that sense was, imagine you had an infinite number or an infinite series of lending a book from the infinite past. You had someone was constantly lending a book out, lending to one person. That person would lend to another. That person would lend to another. You have this infinite series of geometry books, say, that were completely just being lended out. We would still want to ask the question, why a geometry book instead of a physics book? Why is there an infinite series of books being lended at all? So those questions would still arise. You have a question?
What I've heard about the atheists is that they believe that the Earth, the universe is billions of years ago, years old.
Mm-hmm. And so there's this is the question of how old the universe is. And so if the universe did have a beginning, that's a question that we would want to look at. But I think for Christians, the thing that we would need to look at first is whether or not the Bible teaches that the universe or the age of the earth that is taught in the Bible. And this is a controversial question. How old does the Bible say the universe is or that the earth is? This is controversial. It's a good question, but it's not one that we're going to look at today. And so there's a lot of Christians that are what's called old earth creationists. They believe that the universe is 13.7 billion years old, or however old the universe is. They believe the earth itself is 4.5 billion years old, or however old scientists nowadays are claiming. But they say that life on this planet arose through divine intervention. God brought the sentient life on earth about. God was the one who created man and all that kind of thing, but the universe is that old. The account in Genesis chapter 1, doesn't tell us how old the universe is. That's what old earth creationists believe. And so on the other hand, you have young earth creationists who believe that the earth is, or the universe as a whole is about 6,000 to 8,000 years old. This view, as far as I understand, is growing. Less and less people are holding this view. More and more people are going toward an old earth view.
I personally think it's not. The evidence for old earth is completely flawed. I mean, the carbon dating thing is basically not accurate at all.
Right, and so the question there would be to look at the science, if we can undermine some of the scientific evidence for the age of the earth. But I think more fundamentally as Christians, what we would have to do is look at the interpretation of the Bible, because the Bible is the ultimate authority, I would say. It's not science that gives us the absolute truth. It's more the Bible, because the Bible is literally from God. And so what we would need to do first is interpret the Bible correctly. And so the question there is whether or not the Bible actually, the best interpretation of Genesis 1 is that the universe is 6,000 to 8,000 years old, or however old. And so that's sort of an open question. And that's something that we're going to look at. We're going to look at the subject of creation and evolution, the various interpretations that are on offer right now. And so there's a lot. There's a lot of scholarship on this. And I think that the scholars, or Bible scholars, believing evangelical Christians, are leaning toward these old earth views, these old earth interpretations of the Old Testament in Genesis chapter 1. And so that's something, again, that we'll look at. And for by all means, feel free to look into it yourself. We can discuss it later on after class and all that sort of thing. But so to your question of whether or not the scientific evidence can be undermined, I'm completely open to all of that. If there's no good reason to trust carbon dating and all that sort of thing, it doesn't bother me. What I'm more worried about is whether or not the Bible teaches that the earth is however old and whatnot. So that would be my.
My question is so.
Yeah, and so that might be another. Yeah.
I mean, that's why I look at things like that. And we read the Bible. The Bible says so and so and so. We have all these people, scientists, or theologians, and so on, looking at that. And to me, I guess they're trying to prove a point. But as far as I'm concerned,
well, I can understand personally why it's such a big deal, because the scientific consensus, literally, like every scientist out there, even Christian scientists, believes that the earth is however old, and so it is scientific consensus. And so today's culture is very, very aware that scientific consensus holds a lot of weight, especially with non-Christians. And so as Christians, we want to weigh this. We want to say, how can we best evangelize these people? And so if we come at them with stuff that is completely against scientific consensus, then that is just going to. It's going to be that much harder for us to evangelize.
Makes sense.
Right? And so if we put that issue to the side and say, well, look at all of these different interpretations that are on offer for Genesis. There's one book that I'm going to be reading up here pretty soon that's about the ancient. It interprets Genesis 1 as ancient Hebrew cosmology, and it doesn't commit anyone to a young earth view. And so we've got to look at the culture that was there. I'm actually reading a book on biblical interpretation right now. You've got to look at a lot of different factors. You've got to look at the genre that it is. What sort of genre is the Old Testament? What sort of genre are we dealing with? What sort of conventions did they use back in the day? Who wrote it? Who were they writing to? When was it written? What was the culture going on at the time? So the Bible was written for us, but it wasn't necessarily written to us. It was written to the people during that time. And they would have understood things differently than we do. we understand things, we look at science, and so we understand things from a very completely a modern perspective. And so we sort of want to look at the Bible through our view, through our glasses, but they had a different set of glasses on. They understood things differently. They had different motivations for what they wrote. They wrote things to convey certain messages, and the people at that time would have understood that. But we, maybe it's so nuanced, maybe it's so, that we're so far removed from that culture that we can't grasp those goals that they had in mind when they were writing. All of these questions come into play. We can't treat the text superficially. We can't just read Genesis 1 and think we've got it figured out after we read it, once through. Or maybe we have a study Bible and we've read some commentary. We need to really seriously investigate these issues. We do the Bible a disservice when we just read it superficially, just read it once and then think that we've got it all figured out. We've got to, I think, put a lot more time and effort into understanding and interpreting the Bible. Because, I think I made that point. But so we're past time here. Unless there's any other questions, we'll go ahead and close out. And until next time.
Get out to study Hebrew, because that's where
Hebrew is another, it's studying the Hebrew language and the way that they wrote and all that kind of thing is... Because what we have are interpretations of the Bible. We have English translations, and sometimes these translators get it wrong.
Absolutely.
And so, yeah.
Do you agree that the Bible, like in terms of the creation of the earth and how the earth is even shaped, it basically points to a flat earth instead of a round earth? Points to the earth being the center of the universe and not, just something that just has we're like one little speck in the galaxy of a billion solar systems. Like scientists say, like there's a lot of scripture that kind of points to that, like God saying that the earth will roll like a scroll.
Yeah. And so again, what we have to do is we have to take those verses, and we got to look at what sort of genre we're dealing with, whether or not we're dealing with metaphor, which was used explicitly throughout Scripture. There's a lot of metaphors. There's anthropomorphisms about God, when they say that God was resentful or he was mad or that sort of thing. Those are anthropomorphisms. There's a lot of things in Scripture that to us, as modern readers, we want to just understand it at face value. We want to say that, because the earth had four corners, then the earth is flat. No. There was other theological motifs, other theological ideas that the author was trying to convey, and that the readers at the time would have understood. And so, and we can go back. I mean, there's a lot more to say about that.
The round Earth has been around for 500 years. I mean, the ancient, even the ancient other religions believed in a flat Earth theory.
Right.
It's not only the Hebrews that believed in a flat Earth. I mean, there are even maps that point to the flat Earth.
Right.
So the belief of round Earth is new. So that means we just need to accommodate to their belief.
Well, so again, I think we've got to look at the Scripture. Well, we've got to look at the Scriptures, and we've got to determine from the Scriptures whether or not it's what is the Bible teaching? What's the best way to interpret these passages? And so we'd have to look at those passages. But let me go ahead and close out, because we gotta close for church. So we can talk after class. So God, we thank you for another time that we could come together and to discuss these important issues. We thank you again for the arguments that you've presented to these people that have had these arguments, even to Muslim theologians. We thank you that you've given them these revelatory insights. And so we thank you again for everything that's going on in this class and to the fellowship and the discipleship that we've got here. So we thank you for all this in the name of Jesus. Amen.